start. I will chair today, so please everyone, if you're not speaking at the moment, not giving the presentation, have your microphones turned off. We will have a panel on Leibniz, metaphysical physics or physical metaphysics. I hope I got the order right. So we will have a bunch of presentations and then a Q&A. For the Q&A, please write your questions in the chat. Okay, and the first person talking is Christian Henkel from the University of Groningen. He will talk about reconciling physics and metaphysics in Leibniz's philosophy. Christian, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you can all see the presentation now, so that should be fine, right?
Yes.
Good. So I will be talking about reconciling physics and metaphysics in Leibniz. And before I get into the detail of the presentation, let me start with some preliminary remarks. So I will be focusing on what has been called Leibniz mature philosophy, so to speak. So I will be focusing on the period roughly starting in the mid-1680s, beginning of the 1690s. A second thing I should note is I'm not so much concerned with physics and metaphysics qua scientific disciplines or qua in virtue of methodologies, and I'm also not so much concerned with any kind of meta principles that metaphysics would mandate any reasonable physics should abide by, such as the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason, or physical causal closure. So what I will be concerned with is how we can reconcile physics and metaphysics, how physics is grounded in metaphysics, in a realist ontology. And I should also note, before really getting into the content, this is sort of a discussion paper. So since this is a round table, I don't take any of what I say to be a knockdown argument or conclusive, but I mean to incite discussion. So I don't claim to be resolving any kind of problems. That would be aiming at way too much. Okay, so once I've said this, let me go one slide further. So Leibniz says a couple of things about physics and metaphysics that might make them seem fairly disparate, and though physics should be grounded in metaphysics. So on the one hand, he says there's this realm of bodies or aggregates which is dealt with by physics. On the other hand, there's the realm of souls or monads. I mean, souls are a kind of monads, as well as minds, which are a kind of souls, and then in turn a kind of monad. And there's supposed to be unities or substances which ground out physics. Physics, on the one hand, is dealing with efficient causes, the kingdom of efficient causes. Metaphysics, on the other hand, is the kingdom of final causes. Okay, so he also says everything that happens in nature happens mechanically. That is, in terms of collisions, in terms of shape and motion, and really it's some kind of in a way kind of a geometrical physics like Descartes, but then amended, of course, by the notion of force, which will be problematized in what is to follow, of course. On the other hand, metaphysics is supposed to give the principles of mechanism. So the principles of mechanism are metaphysical. Furthermore, everything in bodies, as I said before, yes, it takes place through shape and motion. On the other hand, everything that takes place in metaphysics takes place through perception and appetite. Finally, on the one hand, there's a notion of passive force in physics, primitive passive force, and there's a notion of primitive active force in metaphysics. So I should be noting before going to some kind of free approaches that I see one could go for, and that do gain textual evidence from Leibniz's own writings of reconciling these two aims, but there's also some sense, and I said this in the abstract to today's talk, in which the distinction between physics and metaphysics to some extent mirrors the distinction between bodies and minds, but only to some extent. that's also why I will be addressing pre-established harmony, because I think it would be a way of reconciling these two realms. But I think there's also problems pertaining to this. I should also make a quick historical remark, which is I was very struck by studying some later authors post Leibniz, more like in the Wolffian period, 18th century German philosophy, and they seem to be very much concerned with these kinds of problems, like how to negotiate physics and metaphysics, starting from a Leibnizian Wolffian ontology. So this is not something that's anyhow a historical or made up, or I'm putting words into Leibniz's mouth and make up problems that were not perceived in Leibniz time or slightly later. Good. So the first way, I think, of roughly like reconciling these two realms, which are also problematic because there's this notion of derivative force that I want to allude to quickly here, which is derived by some kind of primitive force or active principle. So one way of reconciling these two aims would be occasional causation. I should note that sorry, I forgot about this slide. I should also say that, again, to underscore that this is not a major problem. De Volder, in what I was reading rather recently, asks Leibniz a question that's fairly similar to the one I'm putting to Leibniz, which is, De Volder, this is how Leibniz reports it, had asked where the forces in corporeal substances flow from. But indeed, you, Leibniz, seem to eliminate bodies completely and place them in appearances, and to substitute for things only forces, not even corporeal forces, but perception of appetite. So he seems to be noting a strong, he seems to be perceiving these two realms as strongly disparate in a way, like there's supposed to be some kind of motion or corporeal force in physics, which is not clear how that evolves from some kind of metaphysical realm, since this is only perception. So I've alluded to occasional causation a number of times before. And here's how this option would roughly go. So the suggestion would be, since bodies and matter result from, this is Leibniz's own words, from unities and monads endowed with, or essentially characterized by perceptive or a representative force, why should one not claim that on the occasion of a certain body bumping into one another, the second body perceiving this kind of collision brings it about that it, of its own term, starts to move? I should note that occasional causation, in contrast to occasionalism, is not a model where God would be invoked to solve any kind of, to do any kind of immediate like stepping in. I mean, occasional causation assumes, in contrast to occasionalism, that finite substances are also causally efficacious. So on the occasion of one body bumping into another, the second body brings it about that it starts to move. And this could be thought that this could be done by means of perception. So since occasional causation is something that's not really discussed or not so much discussed maybe in the Leibniz literature, in contrast to occasionalism, which Leibniz rules out for a couple of reasons. It's not supposed to be a naturalized way of explaining nature. It makes the laws of nature arbitrary, and so on and so forth. Occasional causation is not so much discussed, but has passages in Leibniz that one can read in this in such a way that Leibniz seems to endorse occasional causation, is what I'm saying. So here's one passage. From this it follows that bodies, in fact, always gain their motion in collision from their very own force, to which the impulse of another body provides only the occasion for acting and the limitation, so to speak. So this possibility being put forward, why do I think this is not really doing some kind of reconciliation of physics and metaphysics? So I think on the one hand, occasional causation leaves unclear like where motive force comes about, like how motive force comes about in the physical realm. So monads are endowed with some kind of perceptive force, but that's the only force that Leibniz ascribes to them. So they have perception and appetite, but they don't have motive force. And it's unclear how for in occasional causation motive force would arise suddenly. One should also bear in mind that perception is not sense perception. So it's not like one body really perceives the other body and then thinks to itself, I should be doing something here, I should be beginning to move, I should act, I should respond to this. So perception is for Leibniz really just some kind of representative work. So the expression of the external world, the representation of the external world. Also, since substances for Leibniz are radically distinct, in contrast to say, so you have people like other philosophers of the time more in favor of, or even more outspoken in favor of occasional causation, like Cavendish, like substances are disparate, they're completely distinct. So it's not clear that there's some kind of link between the substances that would maybe bridge these two substances and would make this kind of perceptive act, even if it were taken to be sense perception, which is not easier. Finally, I think it's also what also complicates the occasional causation approaches. But Leibniz says substances are a world apart. So it seems to be that for Leibniz, monads alone with God would be doing the same thing that even if no other monad were present. So there seems to be, but it doesn't seem to me that there's really something causally going on in the monadical realm, and occasional causation would be a vain solution to try to get foot in the door and say, like, well, monads actually do make a causal impact on other monads, which they don't. Yeah, I have a quote on worlds apart that I could go through in Q&A. So let's look at the second option, pre-established harmony. So the suggestion here would be that, well, I mean, this is also Leibniz's official view, that in contrast to physical influx and occasionalism, I skipped over the slide earlier for the sake of saving time, he officially endorses in contrast to physical influx and occasionalism. So the idea would be, well, how can we reconcile the mention of the physical? Yeah, they're perfectly synchronized. I mean, there's no spillover of force. There's also something that's shared by occasional causation, and they're both grounded in God's act of bringing them about. I mean, the act of creating them would be grounded in His will. The act of setting them up and providing the certain essences would be grounded in his intellect. So why not go with that? In contrast to occasionalism, it's also a naturalized explanation. But I also see problems with this kind of way of reconciling physics and metaphysics. So again, I think it doesn't really explain how physics is grounded in metaphysics, but I mean, the realm of bodies and the realm of minds are just set up in this independently of one another. So it's not clear how from the mental realm or from the realm of monads, motive force comes about. Pre-established harmony also really doesn't offer much of an explanation, of how to properly understand grounding, other than like going back to God. So it's in a way wavering on the question in a sense. And also, what makes PH, as I call it sometimes, a problematic approach in itself is there's strong textual evidence in Leibniz, but the realm of bodies in itself is not really on the same level as monads. It's only phenomenal. It's a realm of appearances, and pre-established harmony seems to presuppose some kind of dualist ontology, also something shared by successors of Leibniz. And I should also note that in contrast to some of Leibniz followers like Bilfinger, there's no such thing as a physical monad in Leibniz. So it's not there's no such thing that physical monads and mental monads are perfectly harmonized. If this would still raise questions about grounding, this seems more plausible with respect to the question of how motive force comes about. So this is also in a way problematic, I think. although it is his officially endorsed opinion. So the last idea I had of how matter and monads can be reconciled, how physics can be grounded in metaphysics, would be like, why not go with some kind of idealist solution? This seems also to be backed up by strong textual evidence in Leibniz. So where he says matter and motion are not substances of things as much as they are phenomena of perceivers. He oftentimes calls them like the realm of a material he calls appearances, and phenomena are for him something like a rainbow in the sky or an image in the mirror. So they're not something that is to be taken ontologically as real as monads, which are true unities, truly endowed with force, and so on and so forth. So there's textual evidence in this respect. He talks about space and time to be relations, also to be understood as some kind of broad abstractions brought about by the mind. He thinks extension has been wrongly taken by the Cartesians to be a fundamental notion, which it is not. So why not say, well, there's a grounding story to the effect that there's only the mental realm, monads doing that perceptive stuff, and well, this grounds out like what we think is going on in physics, namely apparent collisions and apparent motion, but there's no such thing as real motion, there's no such thing as real bodies, and so on and so forth. So I'm inclined to this kind of solution. And I should also note that I was kind of like struck by some positive reception to some extent of Leibniz of the philosophy of Berkeley. So I was like, what would he be saying to an idealist? And he seems to be kind of in favor to some extent to what some of the things that Berkeley says. But I was thinking to myself, and again, this is just a discussion paper. I don't claim to be solving the matter conclusively here. Maybe this comes at a certain cost, to wit that it doesn't really take physics all too seriously, right? So, I mean, why should we be interested in some of these calculations that we do of merely apparent forces in physics? And why should we really bother with apparent collisions, states of non-existent things? I mean, why should we develop dynamics if that's not really what's happening? I mean, what's happening is some kind of like something in our mind. So even if we develop some kind of physics that's more like a psychology of physics, it's something like we talk more about our minds than about the world. So this would seem to be a cost to bear if you opt for this kind of idealist solution that physics is grounded in monads in a way that the physical realm really vanishes in a certain way. So I think, and this is all I wanted to claim, I think I've been probably a bit wordy and very fast. I hope it was still comprehensive enough. I think in a way we're back to where we started. So I'm raising the following question. So how do we, or how can we reconcile physics and metaphysics in Leibniz? So how is this to be done? How are we to conceive of derivative forces being derived? They're derived from primitive active force, but in what way? How does this work? How is this done? By means of occasionalism? Probably not. By means of physical influx? Probably not. By means of occasional causation? That's problematic. I've been explicitly talking about this. By means of pre-established harmony? Maybe also problematic, or by means of idealism, also problematic. And the same question that de Volder put to Leibniz, like how does motive force come about if the only thing that's really going on is perception and appetites, perceptive forces in monads that are true unities? And that's been it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian. And now the next person, Richard Arthur from McMaster University, who will talk about form, force, and motion in Leibniz's physics.
Okay, I'm going to also screen share, and if I can find it, here we are. Just a second. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, thank you very much, Christian, for your provocative paper. I'm not, since I didn't have the paper, I'm not going to respond to it explicitly, although I think there is an implicit replies to a lot of what you're saying. So what follows here is a synopsis or very quick overview of arguments taken from my new book that's under consideration with OUP. And since this is about 150 pages of argument condensed into 15 minutes, I apologize in advance that I go through quite fast. I think you've already read the abstract, so I'm going to proceed with the paper. So in the discourse, in the Discours de Metaphysique, Leibniz claims in paragraph 18, motion, if one considers only what it precisely and formally comprises, i.e. change of place, is not an entirely real thing. And when several bodies change situation among themselves, it's not possible to determine solely by consideration of these changes to which among them the motion should be attributed. But, he adds, the force or immediate cause behind those changes is something more real, and there is enough of a basis for attributing motion to one body rather than another. And he says something similar to Arnaud a couple of years later, motion in itself, separate from force, is something purely relative, and its subject cannot be determined. Of course, he didn't say these things in English. These are all my translations, I should have said in advance. But force is something real and absolute, and since its calculation is different from that of motion, as I demonstrate clearly, it should not be surprising that nature conserves the same quantity of force and not the same quantity of motion. Now, these remarks have led to us quite a lot of consternation, because in this very same section of the discourse, Leibniz declares that his distinction between force and quantity of motion that he described in the previous section shows the necessity of appealing to metaphysical principles apart from extension. But if, as John Roberts asserts, what Leibniz is referring to here by force is clearly the quantity mv squared that he claims is conserved in all interactions, then it's hard to see how this would allow him to escape the relativity of motion. In fact, Russell had taken him to task for precisely that, because if v is, if we transformed v to v plus dv or v prime or whatever, then mv squared is not invariant. So Roberts suggests that Leibniz's meaning is that there is a frame of reference in which the body has an absolute speed corresponding to this measure of force, although it's not physically determinable. And he may have been taking a lead from Dan Garber, who wrote in 1995, there is, in this sense, a correct frame for determining motion, the frame in which the motions observed are the effects of real underlying forces, which are their causes. But such a frame could never be identified. Motion has a foundation, but one that makes no real or apparent difference in the world of physics. In this way, the theory of motion would seem to float free of its foundations in the notion of force. And here I should note that that is not, Dan will inform us, but it's not really any longer his position. For instance, in his book in 2009, he writes, when we consider force and activity as well, we can actually assign motion and rest, although that's an exposition of Leibniz rather than saying that he's right about that. Okay, so here's the thing. Some 10 years prior to this, prior to his discovery of the conservation of vis viva, Leibniz had articulated a distinction that he held firmly from then on, including in his Dynamica and his correspondence with Clarke. This is his distinction between motion as change of situation and motion with respect to cause. In fact, it was also in that paragraph from the discourse. Now, it's important to realize that situation here is the cetus of his analysis cetus. And since the situation or cetus of two bodies is always mutual, so is their change of situation. And so it's automatically relative. This is what Leibniz means by saying that he could demonstrate it geometrically if he wanted to, as he had, in fact, in his Principia Mechanica of 10 years earlier, where he also argues that it's clear that in the case of two bodies, motion should be attributed to that one which contains the cause of their mutual situation having changed. But how do we identify the causes of changes of situation? This is done, he explains there, by choosing the simpler mode of explaining, which involves reference to a cause from which the remaining changes may be derived more easily. So this is already in 1676. In complex cases, this is done by means of identifying the most intelligible or most apt hypothesis. which is therefore to be regarded as true. And this is the position that he continues to uphold. So in the Dynamica, he writes, universally, when motion occurs, we find nothing in bodies by which it could be determined except change of situation, which always consists in relation, that is, in respect to. Thus, motion by its nature is respective or relative. But this is to understand these things in mathematical rigor. Meanwhile, we attribute motion to bodies according to those hypotheses by which they're most aptly explained. And the truth of the hypothesis is nothing other than its aptness. And there are numerous places where Leibniz says this. Here's another one, for example, from the middle period from 1678. Moreover, for motion, I require not only a change of situation from other things, but also that the cause be in that to which motion is ascribed. For if we consider only change of situation, or what is merely mathematical in motion, that is, change of situation, it cannot be said to which of several bodies changing situation among themselves, motion should be ascribed. And so it happens that in astronomy too, so many hypotheses can be imagined. But if we come to physical causes, then we can more easily establish that to which motion should be ascribed. According to this account of true motion, then, one can say that despite the fact that motion considered geometrically is merely relative, the Copernican system gives the true motions of the bodies in the solar system, since it gives the most apt or most intelligible explanation of them. And the truth of the hypothesis, as we've seen, is nothing other than its aptness. And Leibniz makes this argument in 1676, and he continues to make it all through. So by means of this distinction, Leibniz is thus able to distinguish true motion from a merely apparent one. And this is sufficient to account for his agreement with Newton and Samuel Clerk in 1716 in their correspondence. I grant that there is a difference between an absolute true motion of a body and a mere relative change of its situation with respect to another body. For when the immediate cause of the change is in the body, that body is truly in motion. And then the situation of other bodies with respect to it will be changed consequently, though the cause of that change be not in them. Now, the one thing is he shouldn't have called this absolute true motion, since that suggests an agreement with Newton and Clerk that such motions are not relative, and that's in fact how Clerk understood that. On the contrary, Leibniz had rejected absolute motion, that is, motion with respect to absolute space, not after looking at Newton, but ever since he began to develop his analysis cetus in 1676 or 7. In his very earliest studies, it's true, he presented space as being absolute. It's something quasi-substantial from which the primary matter that fills it receives its extension. And he may have been influenced here by Gassendi, or maybe more, or Patrizzi, we don't really know, probably all of them. But by February 1677, Leibniz has rejected the idea that space is absolute and adopted the view that motion is essentially relative. This is what he wrote in February of that year. If space is a certain thing supposed in pure extension, whilst the nature of matter is to fill space, and motion is change of space, then motion will be something absolute. And so when two bodies are approaching one another, it will be possible to tell which of them is in motion and which at rest, or if both are moving, with what speed they are moving. But in reality, space is not such a thing, and motion is not something absolute, but consists in relation. That is, it's not possible to tell which body is in motion. And so that's here, a modus tollens. For as Leibniz had learned from Huygens in Paris, the conservation of the quantity of motion must be asserted of the action or respective motion by which one body is related to or acts on another. That's another quote from 76. Thus, true motion is not the same as absolute motion, the latter being motion with respect to space. Newton, of course, identifies them, but he wasn't the first. Pardis and Pirelli before him had also done so. So here's Pirelli. The passage of local motion either occurs from one place of mundane space to another, or in the relative space of some container. The former should be called real and physical motion. The latter we will call relative motion, although often it does not involve a change of its situation in place or the space of the universe. But Huygens would have none of this. This is what he wrote about those very passages from Pirelli. Local motion, says Pirelli, is a successive passage from one place to another, etc. But what is place? Is it a mobile space? But how can we call a thing a mobile when we're still seeking the definition of motion? Is a place then a space capable of accommodating a body and defined by its position? then is defined with respect to other bodies. He'd already made the same, that was from quite late, 1687 or so, but he'd already made the same objection in a letter to Oldenburg much earlier in 1669 in reply to a query from a certain William Neal. Now, setting aside the fact that for a period, and while Leibniz was in Paris, Huygens had held that rotation could give a criterion for absolute motion, so I'm just going to set that aside. He and Leibniz agreed that the relativity of motion and impulsive force ruled out absolute motion, that is, motion with respect to absolute space. It simply can't be determined. Yet Leibniz insisted he could preserve the everyday distinction between true and apparent motion in terms of the most intelligible hypothesis. For Leibniz, that body acts in which the reason for the changes is most intelligibly located. It is that body which is the proximate cause of the changes, and this is the way in which we are to determine to which body the motion belongs. Once the proximate cause of the changes has been identified, then we will be able to determine not only which body is truly in motion, but also its degree of speed. And this tallies with the answer Leibniz gave to Clarke. But what then about force? In a collision, the total force, now we're looking at Leibniz's new dynamics, the vis viva, will be conserved, but under a change of hypothesis about which bodies are at rest, the total force will not change. It will be differently distributed between what he calls the directive and the respective forces making up the total force. Thus, contra Roberts and company, force does not provide a criterion for which body is in motion. What it does, rather, is provide the right measure of force for calculating forces under the principle of equipollence of the full cause and the entire effect. How then does Leibniz see the metaphysical implications of his new measure of force? In his Système Nouveau, he explains his new conception of action, namely that substance acts, whose state explains a change in an intelligible way. Then he goes on to say, these considerations, however metaphysical they may appear, are still of remarkable use in physics for establishing the laws of motion, as our dynamics will be able to elucidate. But one can say that in the collisions of bodies, each suffers only from its own elasticity, caused by the motion that's already within it. And as for absolute motion, nothing can determine it mathematically, since everything ends in relations. As a result, there's always a perfect equivalence of hypotheses, as in astronomy, so that however many bodies one takes, it's arbitrary to assign rest or even a degree of speed to any of them you choose, without the possibility of being refuted by the phenomena of motion, whether rectilinear, circular, or composite. However, it's reasonable to attribute motions, true motions, to bodies following the supposition which provides the reason for the phenomena in the most intelligible way. This denomination being in conformity with the notion of action that we've just established. So, some further remarks then on action. On the standard account, shared for instance by Huygens and Newton, the action of one body, the agent, on another, the patient, is understood in terms of its production of a change in quantity of directed motion in the second body. But quantity of motion, absolutely speaking, will be lost in inelastic collisions. Against this conception, Leibniz argued that if action and reaction are understood in terms of the exchange of quantity of motion, then in a collision, either body may equally well be regarded as being the cause or even the subject of motion, since such changes depend only on the relative velocity of the colliding bodies. It follows, he wrote in the unpublished part of the Specimen Dynamicum, it follows from the respective nature of motion that the action or impact of bodies on one another will be the same, provided the speed with which they approach each other is the same. Yet, as we've seen, the subject of motion can be determined by reference to the most intelligible hypothesis for explaining the phenomena in question. For example, if there's a set of skittles and someone throws a ball and knocks them all down, by the relativity of motion, you could reverse it all so that the skittles themselves are moving, and they move, and then the ball goes out and goes back to the hand. But that's not really intelligible at all. The amount of the number of assumptions you will have to make about the initial velocities and so on of everything to get that to work is infinitely well, it's ridiculously complex. And so the simplest one is obviously to regard the ball as being the cause. That's just the cause of these phenomena for explaining this particular set of phenomena. But if force is regarded as a body's capacity to do work, which is what Leibniz has deduced, then there needs to be something in body with that power. As a permanent power, this cannot be vis viva, since like all derivative forces, this is instantaneous. Rather, the permanent power is the substance that is in bodies. And this is what Leibniz writes to Pélisson, who was an ally of his in trying to heal the rupture in the churches. Thus, when one says that the primitive force makes the substance of bodies, one means their nature or essence. Also, Aristotle says that their nature is the principle of movement or rest. And the primitive force is nothing but this principle in each body, from which arise all its actions and passions. I consider matter as the first internal principle of passion or resistance, and it's through this that bodies are naturally impenetrable. And the substantial form is nothing but the first internal principle of action and rest. Entelekeion e proti. Thus, no one could formalize who does not take substance in abstracto as primitive force, which always remains the same in the same body and gives rise successively to the accidental forces and particular actions, which are all only a consequence of their nature or primitive and subsisting force applied to other things. Notice he says here, he's talking about substance in abstracto. In concreto, he goes on to say, it's the subject taken together with this force. And note also that the substance as a monad in the monadology is still the first entelechy of its organic body. So I don't see a change of his metaphysics in that respect. Now let me summarize my main conclusions in point form. Motion, understood geometrically, is change of situation. This is entirely relative, and from it no subject can be determined. The subject of motion can be determined, however, with respect to cause. It is identified in accordance with the most intelligible hypothesis. Motion so determined is still relative to a body taken as at rest. There's no absolute space, only an order of situations of bodies, calculated in accordance with the most intelligible hypothesis. That body acts in which the reason for the changes is most intelligibly located. But this is not action in the sense of transfer of impulsive force, since force of impact depends only on relative velocity. Nor does vis viva determine what is really moving, since this is conserved in each isolated body and merely redistributed on change of hypothesis. So force does not break the equivalence of hypotheses. But in the calculation of forces, the principle of equivalence shows that it is vis viva, not quantity of motion, that is the measure of a body's capacity to act, and therefore to be a cause. It is in this sense that force is relevant to the cause of motion. So here's another quotation from Leibniz. With forces removed, nothing real remains in motion itself, for it cannot be determined solely from variation of situation, where the true motion or the cause of variation really is. Now, insofar as bodies have a capacity to resist change of state, that's their inertia, they must have within them a power for this resistance, and that's the passive force. Insofar as they have the capacity to do work, they must have within them a power to act, and that's the active force. Bodies only have these powers or forces insofar as they act. And since a substance is a thing that acts, bodies contain substances within them whose nature is force. The capacity to act, primitive active force, is what is substantial in bodies. This is not a mere potentiality, however, but always involves an endeavor to act. The latter is manifested in the derivative active forces of bodies, which are modifications of the primitive active forces existing at each instant. And this is what is real in motion. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Share.
Okay, and then the next speaker will be Dan Garber, whose title is Leibniz's Physics Consistent with His Monadology? Dan, do you have a PowerPoint?
Of course I have a PowerPoint. Let me just figure out
the share screen at the bottom.
There we go. No. There we go. Okay. Thank you very much. What I'm going to talk about is actually related in interesting ways to what Christian and Rick have talked about. In my brief contribution, to this roundtable, I'd like to sketch out a story about the development of Leibniz's views on the physical world that involve both his developing dynamical view of the world and the metaphysics that accompanied it. Given the brief time that I have to outline my thesis, I'm going to talk in very broad strokes and leave out lots of details, but perhaps we can fill them in during the discussion. Now, Leibniz's earliest physics was deeply influenced by Hobbes. At that time, when he was less than 25 years old, he adopted the view that the only genuine cause of motion is motion itself, and that bodies offer no resistance to being set in motion. And as a result of this, the laws of collision that he proposed were just the laws of the composition of velocities. And so, for example, in collision, size plays no role in the outcome. Furthermore, when two bodies with equal and opposite motions collide, regardless of their size, their motions will cancel each other out and both will come to rest. But in the summer of 1676, when Leibniz was about 30 years old, he had a revelation. In an essay that he wrote at that time, he emphasized, and here, let me see if I can, there we go. And he emphasized that just as the first axiom in geometry is that the whole is the sum of its parts, the first axiom in mechanics is that the equality or equivalence between full cause and entire effect, something that Rick alluded to in his presentation. A clear consequence of this is the conservation of force or power, the ability that a body in motion has to do work. In January 1678, Leibniz discovered that this entailed that the quantity mv square must be conserved. The size of bodies matter, and motion cannot be lost or gained in collision, as he originally thought it was. For this to happen, even bodies at rest must resist being put into motion or being stopped, a radical change from his earliest physics. And this is another quotation from that essay from 1676. In this way, Leibniz introduces two forces into his world, the active force associated with bodies in motion and a passive force of resistance to motion. This, I would claim, marks the beginning of the dynamics project, the science of force which develops and grows and ultimately reaches its fullest expression in the later Dynamica of 1690. But these early discoveries in physics had important ramifications for Leibniz's metaphysics. In a piece from the late 1670s, in which he outlined the new science that he was developing at the time, Leibniz wrote, and I'll read at least the beginning of this. There follows now a discussion of incorporeal things. He had talked about the other things that he was going to put in this book. By the way, a book that he never wrote. Certain things take place in body which cannot be explained from the necessity of matter alone. Such are the laws of motion, which depend upon the metaphysical principle of the equality of cause and effect. Then that is that the full cause must contain all of the ability to do work, all of the force that one finds in the effect. Therefore, we must deal here with the soul and show that all things are animated. So Leibniz goes from this new metaphysical principle that he had articulated, the equality of cause and effect, to the positing of souls or forms in matter. These forms or souls were conceived as internal sources of the activity of bodies, both active and passive. There must be something in body to explain how it is that bodies act when they're in motion and how it is that they resist acquiring motion. In this way, with the reform of physics comes a reform of the metaphysics of body as well. But there is more to Leibniz's metaphysics at this moment. And let me return to this passage that's now on the screen and continue. After the portion of this passage where he says, therefore we must deal with the soul and show that all things are animated, Leibniz goes on to say, without soul or form of some kind, a body would have no being, because no part of it can be designated which does not in turn consist of more parts. Thus, nothing could be designated in a body which could be called this thing or a unity. These two ideas are linked in Leibniz's mind. This alludes to another theme in Leibniz's thought that goes from the 1670s on into his later philosophy, the importance of unity and individuality in connection with being. Leibniz is here articulating in this sentence or alluding to a principle that he will later present in the correspondence with Arnaud in this memorable way. I hold this identical proposition differentiated only by the emphasis to be an axiom, namely that which is not truly one being is not truly one being either. The only things that really exist in Leibniz's world are genuine individuals, genuine unities. All reality must be grounded in genuine individuals. But in bare extension, as in, for example, Descartes' conception of body, there is divisibility to infinity. There are no genuine individuals. And so Leibniz argues there must be something in extended bodies from which individuality arises, and that, for him, is form or soul. But it is not the form or soul itself that is the individual in question at this point. The genuine individual that grounds the reality of the physical world is, for Leibniz, a union of a body and a soul that constitutes an animate creature, what he will call a corporeal substance. On this metaphysics, all bodies in nature are colonies of living things, organic bodies made one by virtue of having a soul. Bugs and bugs to infinity, a world teeming with life. Looking something like this. Leibniz here, this is a microscopic blow up of pond water. Leibniz seems here to have been inspired by the new microscopical discoveries of Leeuwenhoek and Swammerdam, to whom he refers explicitly a number of times. With this, we have a second motivation for reviving substantial forms or souls in the late 1670s, the need for unity and individuals in the world. So by the late 1670s and into the 1680s, Leibniz had two distinct kinds of argument that led largely to the same conclusion, both the need to introduce force into the world and the need to ground reality in unity and individuals seemed to lead to the introduction of soul or form into the material world. Leibniz must have felt very encouraged by the fact that these two approaches seemed to converge on a single metaphysics of body. In the years that followed, Leibniz developed both of the metaphysics that grew out of the Dynamical project, a metaphysics of force and the metaphysics of unity, an infinite number of corporeal substances, each a body unified by a soul. While the technical dynamics is developed in the Dynamica of 1690, the metaphysical program of the dynamics can be found in the Specimen Dynamicum of 1695. Other texts as well, but that's sort of the exemplary text. There, Leibniz presents a fourfold hierarchy of forces, distinguishing between active and passive, primitive and derivative. And Rick Arthur made reference to this in his talk. Primitive, what's interesting here is in in the earlier writings, both active force and passive force are related to form. In the primitive forces are that in body, which is the foundation of what he calls the derivative forces, which are the momentary states of the primitive forces. So primitive active force is associated with form or soul. Primitive passive force is now associated with the scholastic notion of matter. The derivative forces are what he calls living force and dead force. Living force is what Rick Arthur had alluded to in his talk, which is the force associated with a body actually in motion. Dead force is the force associated with a body starting motion, for example, an arrow beginning to come out of a bow. And the passive forces are impenetrability and resistance to motion. But he now, as I said before a moment ago, he instead of associating both kinds of forces with form or soul, he now introduces the notion of matter to account for the primitive passive force. This then is the conception of body, primitive active and passive force. That is form and matter, the stuff that grounds the variable magnitudes of active and passive forces, the derivative active and passive forces, which are the subject matter of physics, properly speaking. And in this way, body is literally just force, active force and passive force. But alongside the dynamical metaphysics, Leibniz continued to develop the metaphysics of unity. This is most evident in the 1680s in the important correspondence with Arnauld, which Leibniz focuses on the corporeal substance, the unity of soul and body, the tiny animals that constitute the genuine individuals in the natural world. This line of argument receives its culmination in the Système Nouveau of 1695, published in exactly the same year as the Specimen Dynamicum. But while there are two lines of argument, there is only one metaphysics of body. Body consists of form, soul, and matter, body. The form or soul is both the source of active force and it's the source of the unity of the tiny animals or corporeal substances. The matter, body, is both the body of the corporeal substance and the passive force, and all seems to be in harmony between these two metaphysical pictures. But shortly after the publication of the Système Nouveau, Leibniz took a very important step in his metaphysics of unity. The term monad appears for the first time in a letter to the Marquis de l'Hôpital in July of 1695. And he writes, "The key to my doctrine on this subject consists in the consideration of that which is genuinely a real unity, a monad." By the late 1690s, it is clear that we are dealing with a world whose ultimate constituents are simple, non-extended, mind-like substances, the familiar monads of the much later monadology. The corporeal substances, souls or forms, and organic bodies, tiny animals introduced in the late 1670s as the ultimate constituents of reality, have been replaced by a new foundation, non-extended, immaterial monads. The bodies that make up the world must now be understood as being grounded in some sense or another, not in living beings, animals, but in something like minds, unextended perceivers. And this is what it is that Christian had been talking about, I think. In the earlier picture, where the world was made up of tiny animals, bodies and souls, there was an obvious place to put the forces that constituted the metaphysical grounding of the dynamics. Primitive active force was the soul, primitive passive force, the body. But when the body has, in a way, dissolved in favor of mind-like monads, where is there for the forces to go? With the dissolution of the body into monads, there comes a kind of dissolution of the neat consensus and complementarity between the dynamical metaphysics and the metaphysics of unity that seemed to drive Leibniz's metaphysical project from the late 1670s on. The question of how to ground force in the monadological conception of body is quite closely connected with the question of how to interpret bodies in the monadology. I have argued elsewhere that this is a problem that Leibniz never solved to his satisfaction in later years. This conclusion extends to the interpretation of the dynamical metaphysics in the context of the theory of monads as well. Leibniz has sometimes advanced the view that bodies are aggregates of these mind-like monads, for example, in the De Volder correspondence. In that context, he attempted to put the primitive forces, both active and passive, into the monads and the derivative forces in the infinite aggregates of monads that constitute bodies. It's quite striking that even after introducing monads, active and passive force, primitive and derivative, are still very much in Leibniz's vocabulary, and he's looking for a place to put them. But the view of bodies as aggregates of monads has substantial problems. Leibniz didn't want to give up the idea of unity and individuality as the central criterion of reality, and thus bodies on that view would seem to be completely unreal, what he calls phenomenal, insofar as they lack any genuine unity. It wasn't easy, by the way, to find pictures of monads on the internet. These ones are very tiny but still extended, so it's not an exact resemblance. But you can see the organization under the corporeal substance picture versus these individual and causally unconnected individual monads under the monadological picture. Later in correspondence, there are other problems, by the way, with putting primitive forces in the monads and derivative forces in the aggregates. But later in the correspondence with Debose, Leibniz discussed how to make real unities of the aggregates of monads by way of what he called a substantial bond, a metaphysical glue that transformed the aggregates of monads on the right side of your screen into substances, like the corporeal substances on the left side of your screen. This led him first to the view that there were different kinds of primitive force, a kind of form, soul, and matter in the monad, and then a different kind of form or soul and matter in the unity that the substantial bond makes from the monads. But this duplication is strange and inelegant. This led Leibniz finally to the view, and again in the Debose correspondence, that form and matter exist not in the monads, but in the substantial bond itself that holds the monads together. But on this view, unfortunately, as Leibniz came to realize, the monads seem unnecessary and seem to drop out of the picture altogether. Again, not something very satisfactory. So where are we left? In the end, I think the two beautiful metaphysical projects, the dynamical project, the science of force, and the metaphysics of unity, which seemed so complementary and consistent with one another when first introduced, a beautiful bundle, end up impossible to combine. Two inconsistent projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. So our last speaker will be Anne-Lise Ray from the Université Nanterre. She will talk to us about dynamics, action, and monads in Leibniz's physics. And then we'll have, I think, about 40 minutes of questions. So write your questions in the chat. Anne-Lise, do you have a PowerPoint?
No, sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint.
Perfect.
Just a paper.
Perfect.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to see you again. So, yes, my paper is about the metaphysical stakes of Leibnizian dynamics. And in this paper, I would like to discuss one fundamental presupposition in Dan's position, but Dan is not alone to defend this position. That is the idea that there are two distinct metaphysical lines of research, the dynamical one for the corporeal substances and the monadological ones for the simple substances. My point here is to show that taking into account the concept of action, like Rick did it in a sense, just before, is a way, so taking into account the concept of action is a way to give a new formulation to the metaphysical stakes of dynamics in Leibniz philosophy. So I am beginning by developing a bit Dan's presupposition, and then I give arguments to discuss it or even criticize it. First, the presupposition. It seems to me that for Dan, the dynamics has to be understood as a general intellectual project which can't be circumscribed to the formulation of the word Dynamica. That is, we can talk about dynamics even if the word is not mentioned by Leibniz, even before the invention of the new science in 1689-1690, the Dynamica des Potentia et Actiones. We must think the dynamics upstream and downstream of the text of 1689. This intellectual global project is understood like the means to conceptualize the corporeal substances as fundamental explanation of the material world. And this project is distinct, to not say opposite, to the monadological project. And coherently, following the same methodological approach, the monadological project can't be reduced in this perspective to the 1740s text, which will be until later the monadology. The monadological project is rather clearly considered a metaphysical project to found a conception of the world in non-extended entities and similar in the mind. The consequence seems clear. There will be two lines of metaphysical research quite separate. First, the dynamical metaphysics concerning the corporeal substances. Second, the metaphysics of unity concerning the mind-body relationship unified. The main consequence of this assertion is the impossibility to think in the same conceptual framework the dynamics of force and the conceptualization, the later conceptualization of the substance. And especially from 1695, that is the publication of the new system and the first part of the Specimen Dynamicum, this opposition becomes insurmountable. A contrario, I would like to argue three different points. First, the Dynamica must be considered in the strict sense for the specific project it involves. That is to say, as a theoretical space, territory, which guarantees the transition and the articulation of the abstract elements to the concrete corporeal realities, bodily realities. Second, the concept of action is not, for me, an inessential complement of the theory of forces. it is a central concept, a mixed concept, and for this reason, a complex one, which makes this project of articulation possible and funds its coherence. We have to understand what does it mean to move from a dynamics of force to a dynamics of action. Third point, the metaphysical stake of the unity and the individuality can be understood less as another metaphysical line than as a metaphysical, I repeat. Third point, the metaphysical stake of the unity and the individuality can be understood less as another metaphysical line than as a metaphysics of force that is understable thanks to what the new conceptuality of action allows us to think from 1690. To defend this reading, I would like to answer 3 questions. First, what is the metaphysics of dynamics? Second, how does action intervene in this metaphysics? Third, how does it build a coherent metaphysical project that provides tools to resolve the dead ends left by the metaphysics of force? So I begin. First, to what extent can we make dynamics understood as a science of force, a theoretical space producing a metaphysical conception of the physical world, of the created world? It seems to me important to distinguish. On a side, the dynamics as it is developed from De Corporum Concursu, with the establishment of the equivalence between the full cause and the entire effect, and the resumption of estimation in Huygens by MV au carré, the rehabilitation of substantial forms, such as it is formulated in the Pensée sur l'instauration d'une physique nouvelle in 1679, that is thoughts on the establishment of a new physics, and which want to be a public snub, namely the Brevis Demonstratio of 1686. In this Brevis Demonstratio, Leibniz points to the Cartesian failure on 2 levels. The status of motion, which is something relative and which doesn't have the fundamental character of force, and the status of estimation, is it the same quantity of movement, which is conserved in the case of heat shock, or for the whole universe? So, in a part, we can distinguish the dynamics described as I just did it, and in another part, the introduction of the neologism of Dynamica, which appeared in 1689-1690. With the system of forces, Leibniz sets up an articulation that he will then decline in a very tight conceptual network, which is the active and passive, primitive and derivative forces, distinguish and oppose themselves, according to a schema that Leibniz describes in detail in the Specimen Dynamicum, the first part, in 1695. The peculiarity of this schema is that it establishes correspondences between the primitive and derivative forces, which refer respectively to the substantial order and the phenomenal order, in such a way that their relationship is thought on the mode of the representation or the expression. Now, it is from a theoretical perspective, internal to physical theory, that Leibniz introduces the concept of action following after the science of forces. It was, of course, a way to introduce more clearly the time in the estimation of the exercise of the power which produces the movement. But more important for what interests us here, it was a way to provide an a priori proof of the principle of conservation by isolating what escapes its physical conditions in what determines the movement. It was therefore a means to identify in everybody a formal effect which preserves its force but does not consume it. What is at stake here is the introduction of the action. It was thus the need to forge an entity which makes it possible to explain the fact that the body exerts a movement of oneself, the famous actio in se ipsum. Now, by doing this, Leibniz introduces a metaphysical notion at the heart of dynamics, a metaphysical notion that he defines in the same way in bodies and in simple substance. That is, as action on itself or immanent action. That is to say, this framework allows him to produce an explanatory unit of the movement of bodies and of perception of the simple substance, rather than to establish an expressive comparison between the two systems of force. You can object or more simply ask why this action in se ipsum has to be considered as a metaphysical notion. So the question still unresolved is how this dynamic concept is articulated with the metaphysics of the 1690, that is to say, for Leibniz, as he writes, it in the New System, in the De Ipsa Natura, or in the letters to the Voltaire, that dynamics clarifies the notion of substance. My hypothesis is therefore that in the general economy of Leibnizian metaphysics, the passage through dynamics understood as a science of power and action, has for stake no longer only to affirm the activity of substance, but to demonstrate its essential character. Of course, since the first text of 1686, in particular the Discourse of Metaphysics, Leibniz asserts that the substance, in this case the individual one, is essentially active. The expression according to which the actiones sunt suppositorum clearly indicates that each of the states of substance, each of its perceptions arise from its own background. The device of the quadripartition of forces, active and passive, primitive, derivative, made it possible to think an analogy between the internal force of bodies and the spontaneous activity of the substance. And I do agree with Fichon when he asserts that the meaning of action consists in saying that the action on itself in the movement corresponds or responds to the immanent action of substances. To say this is to seal, through the dynamics, the metaphysical unity of reality, insofar as it is on the same concept, the same signifying unity, which makes intelligible and as such links movement in bodies and the series of perception in simple substances. The stake of action in its very ambivalence is to make us move from a relation of analogy to a relation of correspondence between the phenomenal field and the substantial field. We can clearly see how an interpretation of the supposed bankruptcy of dynamic metaphysics, such, for example, as Dan writes, the quasi-exclusive privilege granted to a text, the specimen dynamicum, and within this text to the quadripartition of force, equates to obscuring a set of textual evidence which throughout the 1690s construct, on the contrary, the entry of the action onto the public scene as object of conservation of dynamics and as essence of the substance. That is precisely what made possible the establishment of the monadological device of Leibniz's last metaphysic, insofar as the dynamics made it possible to think, thanks to the same meaning of a single word, the unity of the intelligibility of reality. It is indeed possible to consider the quadripartition of forces as what maintains a convenient but nonetheless expressive division between the phenomenal field and the metaphysical field. As Laurence Boucquiot suggested, something resists the idea that the movement of bodies is an image, a simple representation of the activity of substances. So to explain this resistance, one could say, of course, at one end of the spectrum that this leads to the shaping of incompatible metaphysics, incompatible with each other, the so-called dynamics of corporeal substances and that of unity. And that this incompatibility ends up leading to the exclusion of dynamic metaphysics in favor of the sole metaphysics of unity, which will later be called monadology. But at the other end of the spectrum, we must undoubtedly go further and consider that action is what makes it possible to reduce homology and unify the field of intelligibility of reality. The dynamics in that it articulates under the same regime of intelligibility and thus unifies corporeal substances and simple substances under the same explanatory principle is this theoretical moment in Leibniz thought which forms the activity of simple substances. We can thus understand all the formulas of the text of the 1690s in which Leibniz continuously repeats that dynamics makes substances intelligible. The idea of a simple illustration of the metaphysical device in the phenomenal field does not derive from Leibniz's work of conceptualization in this text. The project of the 1695 text is indeed to unify physics and metaphysics, to reconcile, I don't know, but surely to unify. But instead of conceiving that the dynamic corresponds to the only physical field, and that it must therefore be unified with the metaphysical consideration relating to the unity that Leibniz will develop independently in relation to this line of conceptualization, and which would lead to the recognition of the failure of the unification project, I propose, on the contrary, to consider that dynamics is precisely the conceptual field which articulates physics and metaphysics, and thus guarantees the unity of the intelligibility of reality. By this, we also understand how the discourse on corporeal substances and the discourse on simple substances, which could be conceived as different forms of intelligibility, are unified thanks to the word, to the concept of action, and will thus be able to allow thinking, thanks to the concept of perfection, the relationship between substances and God. And it is in this sense that action makes the introduction of the monad possible. Okay, thank you. I hope I was not too long, and I hope I was clear. Okay.
Thank you. So now we can officially move on to the questions part. We have a question from Bill Eaton in the chat.
Could we have, might we have a bathroom break? Just a small.
Yeah, we could take a 5-minute break.
Yeah, 5-minute break.
And people can write their questions in the meantime.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So I guess we'll take a 5-minute bathroom break. At Braun, I think this would be the moment when people sing.
I'm not sure about that, Claudia. I think this is the moment when people would get up and get a glass of Palinka.
It is true.
But it's too early for Palinka in Princeton.
Not here, not here. We're ready.
You're ready for it. Well, I'm sorry we don't have any that we can pass around.
What was that, Dan? You were going to pass around a drink?
Absolutely, except we haven't figured out. I mean, if we could only figure out how to do something like that, that it seems to me would make Zoom conferences perfect.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We have to have a pre-established harmony of drinks in our hands. And so,
no, I want
interaction, but there isn't one. We all have our drinks separately.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, that would be okay, but it would be even better.
Well, they're phenomenal drinks.
Actually share a bottle. What?
Phenomenal drinks.
Phenomenal drinks, right?
Okay, people are trickling back in. Should we give it one more minute and start?
1 more minute. Claudia, why don't you?
Okay, everyone is back, I guess. So, Bill, do you want to read out or like tell us your question for Dan?
Yeah, sure. So it's really for the whole panel, I guess. But you had mentioned Leibniz's objection to extension as the essence of matter, that because extension is infinitely divisible, it never bottoms out. Leibniz says that in a couple of places. But there's one passage where he seems to say another problem with extension as the essence of matter is that bodies would only be able to exist for like an instant or something. And it just seemed to me that a Cartesian like De La Forge specifically, or even Descartes in the third meditation, could respond that bodies in a sense do have that sort of instantaneous existence, and that God sort of preserves bodies or allows them to persist through this constant act of recreation. So it's maybe a trivial question, but I just wondered what you thought of it.
No, I think it's not a trivial question at all.
And thank you for a wonderful, amazing panel.
This has been fun. I want to thank my other co-panelists as well. But I mean, to respond to your question, Leibniz can't deny continual sustenance, God as the causa secunda messe of bodies. They're continuing, persistent cause. But he doesn't want to interpret it the way in which Descartes does, which is as God recreating bodies from moment to moment. Actually, I'm not sure that Descartes really did believe it. in exactly that way.
Thinks it's like one continual act of creation somehow. So
right, exactly. God sustains bodies, and as it were, recreates them from moment to moment. But he means, I think, that any particular moment can be regarded as a moment of creation, even though I think it's not discontinuous.
it just seems like it's an easy way to account for emotion as a change in situation, which is something like
Can I jump in there?
wants to do. So
Please.
Yeah.
Rick.
Yeah, I agree with Dan. I think the thing that the thing was really important for Leibniz was that the whatever it was that was the cause of a body's actions should be contained in the body itself, and he thought that for very strong religious reasons right from the beginning. And so his main objection to Descartes was precisely that, having God perform this act of putting bodies in different places and so on, and that at least some of the Cartesians, I agree with Dan that it wasn't probably Descartes, but at least that was how he was getting interpreted by Placelli and various other people. So Leibniz, as a Lutheran, very much wanted God to have put in the creation the wherewithal for everybody, for every creature, I should say, in the world to go through its own changes. And this he saw as completely absent in the mechanist way of conceiving the world.
I mean, this is also something that he said to Malebranche or to the occasionalists, that they were not providing a naturalized, they were not giving a naturalized account of how it could be changed in the world of bodies, of physics, in that God would have to step in, and the reason for a change in body would ultimately be grounded in God's, sometimes he thinks, perpetual stepping in. So I mean, Malebranche famously, for instance, says something like a body would have to be recreated at every
second
part of space, or like that, to account for its motion. So Leibniz would be very unhappy with that. I agree. So that would be not a naturalized explanation.
But certainly God permits its existence at every moment, and that's sufficient to create it. But yeah, I think the big problem with Descartes' physics is just without that minimal force of resistance, those extended bodies can't really interact. But thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you, Bill. Now we have a question from Jeremy that was also sort of drawing Descartes into the picture. Jeremy, do you want to?
Yeah, hi. This was a question for Professor Garber, specifically about his treatment of unity in Leibniz's Metaphysics and Leibniz's, if not anti-Cartesianism, at least hesitancy about Cartesianism. And the question is this: Leibniz seems to think that you never arrive at a thing because matter, you never reach a thing. Descartes, I think, would think that not only is it not the case that you never reach a thing, but you reach a thing, a hoc aliquid, on every tier of size. Why is that? Because each part of matter, no matter how small, has its own true and immutable nature or essence, which after all accounts for the fact that it is a thing, that it's a unity per se, that it's a substance, that you can construct a real distinction between it and any non-overlapping part of matter. What do you think Leibniz would say about that? Considered solely as a question of unity, not a question about force, because you seem to bifurcate these two strands, or at least isolate one from the other.
Well, this is what Leibniz does say about it. I mean, he addresses that question actually in a number of places. I think most interesting is the way in which he treats it in De Ipsa Natura, an essay that he published in 1698. The problem is, if all there is in body is extension, I mean, what Descartes wants to say is each hunk of extension constitutes a separate substance. Right, Jeremy?
Yeah.
However, what Leibniz is going to say is, how do you re-identify the hunk of substance from one moment to the next? What constitutes, this hunk of substance now, in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes. If body is just extension, then there is nothing in it that differentiates it intrinsically from any other part of extension.
It's the quantity. It's that it's a race quanta, as he says in
Yeah, yeah. But what? Okay, we have a cube with a certain volume. What differentiates that cube from another? How can you differentiate these two situations? This cube remains the same over, say, a 5-minute period, as opposed to, every 5 seconds, it's replaced by an indistinguishable and altogether identical hunk of body. What is it that makes this cube of corporeal substance, body, the same from one moment to the next? If it could be replaced by an identical and in every respect indistinguishable cube of extended substance. And this is what the argument that Leibniz makes, is that in order for these bodies to have real identity, there has got to be something in them over and above extension.
I think Descartes should say that what you've described isn't the way you've described it. It's not that it's been replaced by a qualitatively identical portion of matter. It's that a particular quantity of matter has endured over time. No one would say otherwise, as he says.
But what makes it that particular quantity of matter and not another?
It's the amount.
No intrinsic properties over and above extension.
Well, but if you add more properties, you can raise the same question. But I think what he's thinking is that these quantities, these true and immutable natures of parts of matter, are individual. They come individualized. And I see, what I thought you were going to ask is what happens if you have two quantitatively identical quantity.
Right. But if they come individualized, there's got to be something in them over and above extension.
It's the amount of extension, I think he thinks. Anyway, we should probably go on, but that's what you think Leibniz would say, the de natura stuff.
Yeah, no, I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we should go on to Vincenzo De Risi, who had a question for Ricardo, I think.
Hello, thank you to everyone. I have a lot of questions. I will do just one for Rick on true and absolute motion. That is, it seems to me that in your reconstruction of true motion, you have somehow restricted frames of reference for determining true motion, in the sense that, take the billiard ball, you can say where the force is and therefore where the true motion is. Then you take the planetary motion and you can say that true motion is the one of the planets rather than the sun.
Right.
Now the question is whether there's different contexts in which you determine which motion is true should be integrated someone with one another. And the question is whether you may get somehow a general idea of which motion is true in the universe, appealing to larger and larger ideals of more intelligibility and so on. This is something that Kant suggests in order to get to Newton absolute space. That is saying that if we get this most general idea of which motion is really true in the context of the whole universe, then you get absolute motion and in some sense absolute space. Yeah. Would this work for Leibniz according to you, or there are some limitations because we and we cannot do that,
yeah. Thank you, Vincenzo. A very perceptive question, as of course I would expect. On my reading, you're quite right. It's context dependent. that Leibniz thinks that the true motion corresponds to what you would ordinarily say. So we don't start talking about someone not having thrown a baseball because you can take another frame of reference where the motions are different. And so it is specific, on my reading, it's specific to the phenomena that you are trying to explain. And so Leibniz himself takes that to quite an extreme when he's trying to negotiate with the censors in Italy. And he wants to say that, well, even the earth-centered ones are true within a certain context. And if the context is trying to explain to someone what appear in the sky when you're standing on the earth, then those are going to be the true motions. And so it's certainly not a true motion in the sense that it can be taken beyond that context. So the idea is you've got a physical problem and you solve it within the context of that problem. And there isn't an overall scheme on that thing. Now, whether Leibniz ever really confronted that himself, I don't know. Because you might say there's a kind of assumption that we've got a plenum here, and the plenum seems to demand some kind of overall space. But on the other hand, you've got all of everything that he says about what space is, what absolute space is for him, is it's the space in which you calculate the motions. And so it is only a space for, in terms of the immobile space, right? The space is immobile for the sake of calculating the motions for a particular problem. And he's quite clear on that, and that's connected with his idea of space as an order of situations, and therefore only being a phenomenon, and not being, in that sense, only being phenomenal, right? So in that sense, when you're looking at solving the physical problem, space in that sense is that order of phenomena, even if it's not really a phenomenon strictly speaking, it's an order of phenomena, right? And so that's different again from the sense in which he talks about absolute space in the Analysis Situs. And so where we're talking about an abstract space. But anyway, so that would be my answer, that he would not go the way that Kant went. But I'm not sure that he ever fully confronted that.
Wow. Thank you very much, Rick.
Thank you. Okay, so Ohad.
So thanks, everyone. Very, very interesting and provocative talks. I just like to make a rather minor comment on the image that Dan has used for the monads. I mean, I think there's a, you know, it's wonderful to have illustrations, but I think it could be also very misleading. And I just insist that monads are neither small nor large. They just have no extension. And the main, you know, we know that they're unities that have no parts, but Leibniz doesn't say anything about there being small or tiny or anything like that. And in fact, the examples are very confusing. The I is the ego, or example. So I'm just very hesitant about using such images, especially, I mean, for, you know, I know Dan knows all this, but it just might be, you know, it might lend to confusions and misconceptions.
No, I apologize. It was, as I said, it wasn't easy to find pictures of monads on the internet. But the point that I wanted to make is that, you know, on the modological picture, as developed, for example, in the correspondence with de Volder, the monads are, well, they certainly don't have direct, efficient causal connections with one another. They are, and it is difficult to see how it is that you could put them together to form, for example, corporeal substances, which is exactly the project of the de Beau's correspondence, whether or not you think he took it seriously. That is the intellectual project of the later part of the de Beau's. And I agree with you completely that picture was not an accurate representation. Though if you have a better one, I would be very interested in seeing it.
If I could jump in here, I would actually take issue even more with that picture, because you said, you know, putting the image stuff aside, you said what we have here is the change from the view where you have these causally interacting corporeal substances to monads that aren't causally connected. And I think in both cases, you've got causal connection, but cause is being completely reinterpreted in terms of no action being, being transferred from one to another. You already have that in the picture, and you have that in the later picture too. So for me, there isn't this change of metaphysics that you keep insisting on. There is no monological metaphysics in the sense of a completely different metaphysics than the earlier one, in my view. Anyway, I've defended it at book length, so I won't bore everybody with that.
Can I just think about that for a moment? Yeah. It certainly does seem that there is a major difference between the corporeal substance metaphysics and the monadological metaphysics in this sense. The unities that constitute the natural world in the first case, in the corporeal substance case, are things understood like animals, souls and bodies. In the second case, they are non-extended monads.
You see, I don't agree with that, because in the monadology, the monads, if we're thinking about the substance taken abstractly, right? Then they are like souls and they're immaterial and so on and so on. But they're all embodied. And that's the same picture you have.
But the thing is, the bodies,
corporeal substances are indeed embodied, but what makes them an indivisible, what makes them substantial is the indivisible through time. It's the fact that they remain the same thing through time. They're things that by acting do not change. So I think this is where my agreement with I'm sorry, I'm hogging it a bit. This is where my agreement with Anne-Lise comes in. That it's the fact that there are things that by acting do not change. That gives you the action and the unity all rolled into one. And that's the core thing that remains the same throughout. Of course, there are some changes through the dynamics and everything else, but the core thing that remains the same is what are the unities, are the things that by acting do not change. And so they remain the same through time, and you tell what they are by what they do. And
well, a couple of things. Let me, because this gives me an opportunity to address Anne-Lise's comments. But I mean, with respect to that, I think that there's a real difference between animals on the one hand and non-extended monads as the unities that make up the world. As he said,
animals in the monadology.
Just a moment. There are animals. On the other hand, if you notice in the monadology, there is an enormous gap between the first half on monads and the second half on bodies, and no clear way of going from the one to the other. But still, the idea that the basic unities are non-extended in the case of the monadology, but extended bodies in the case of the...
No, I don't think the unities in the correspondence with Arnaud are extended bodies. He says that what
are they?
Are in every corporeal substance has to have in it a principle, not that the principle, not that you have a principle of unification that unites all of the aggregate into a new thing. He never says that. He says that an aggregate.
Now, which text do you talking about?
Unity in it. What? Anyway, I don't want to hog it.
Paper.
I don't want to hog the floor.
Okay, let me just make a comment about action in Anne-Lise's presentation. The notion, Anne-Lise is absolutely right that in the Dynamica and in the Fornomus, Leibniz introduces the notion of action as being central. And this is part of his a priori proof for the conservation of mv square. And I think it's a very interesting idea to suggest that this replaces force in a certain sense. This is a new way of sort of conceptualizing the physics that replaces the notion of force with the notion of action, which in turn does appear to be a link with the metaphysics insofar as substances are by their nature active. Two things, though, that strike me as worth thinking about here is that, first of all, I think the notion of action in the Dynamica is not the same as the notion of action in connection with substances, for example, in the discourse on metaphysics. And second of all, that the notion of force, active and passive, primitive and derivative, remains a matter of discussion in the de Volder correspondence and the de Bose correspondence in connection with substance. It doesn't go away. It isn't replaced by action in even in the discussion of monads. But that's, well, I'll let it go.
Can I answer, or it's not my turn
no.
now?
No, please answer.
Yes?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Yes, it is precisely the point then, because the question is, what is the place we give to action? And could we consider that the action can replace force as a resolution of the problem? And I do agree with you. For the first point, action is not the same. The action of the Dynamica is not the same of the action of the discourse of metaphysics, surely precisely because the action is in the Dynamica is the axio in se ipsum. It's not the same of the essence of substance because it's not the same metaphysical framework. So I do agree with this point. But precisely, my point was to try to defend the idea that there is a new conceptualization of action thanks to the Dynamica. And that's why it's not possible for me to say Dynamica is all the text where there is force from 16... or you can say perhaps even from the De Corporum Concursu, or perhaps from
even earlier than
the
that.
Brevis Demonstratio. Sorry?
Yeah, even earlier than that, I think.
Yes, sure. So my point was precisely to say that we have to consider. You say technically, but it's not technically only. We have to consider what does it mean precisely in the Dynamica de Potentia, and it's not the same meaning as in Discours of Metaphysics, surely, and that precisely because it's not the same meaning that it has consequences in the definition of substance. Of substance, and that's why he said after in 1688 in the De Ipsa Natura, if you want to understand substance, you have to understand my dynamics, and this dynamics is the dynamics of action in the De Ipsa Natura. That's why it seems to me that if we just have a look on the Specimen Dynamicum on the text of 1695, it's a possibility, but it's not the only one. We can, yes. And if we would like to follow seriously the line of the conceptualization of action and the line of action as axio in se ipsum, we can see the new semantization, the new conceptualization of action in the later text, in the later metaphysical text. So, yes.
We'll continue this discussion.
I know that the point, it seems to me that the point of divergence, of the point of disagreement between us is what is the relationship between force and action? And for you, the force is a main concept and action is something accessory. I don't know how can we say that.
Yes, that's exactly true.
So, but if you do that, you have to conclude that that action is just the object of a new principle of conservation. You can accept that. MVO carré fois time.
Yeah.
But there is no connection. There is a kind of another signification, another meaning for the action in the substance. There is no relationship between these two terms.
No, I think Leibniz thought that there was a relation. I think it's problematic whether there really is.
Because it's difficult to defend the idea that there is a strong connection between primitive force and derivative force. And this strong connection is the relationship between physics in the phenomenal world with derivative force, and metaphysics is engaged in the primitive force. So there is this strong connection, but we know that this strong connection is an impasse, is apoetic, and deciding that for the action it is totally different. And for the action, there is too the same strong connection between formal action and motics action, and between the consideration of action as the essence of substance. So for me, the problem is just here. How could you deal with the different treatments with force and action? So the force is the main point, and I recognize that there is this link between metaphysics and physics, very strong links, and for the action is totally different. It's a secondary point. So could you just answer to this, yes, to this suggestion?
Well,
briefly.
The way in which I read, we should probably let other people get into the discussion, but just very briefly. No, I mean, the way in which I read it, action is introduced. Leibniz introduces the notion of force in the 1670s. This becomes central. And the connection between force and motion is expressed in the conservation of mv squared, which requires the assumption of Galileo's law of free fall, which is a posteriori. Leibniz is uncomfortable about that, is looking for a way of establishing the conservation of mv squared. A priori introduces the notion of action to do that, but the relationship between action and force is problematic, and I'm not sure that he ever is able to connect them properly. But that he continues, I think, to, in later writings, not in the Dynamica, but in later writings, to emphasize force as opposed to action. And the a priori argument outside of the Dynamica really appears very, very rarely. But we can continue to talk about that.
Surely.
Perfect.
We should let other people.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so the next question is from Laura Herrera Castillo.
Okay, thank you everyone for the terrific talks. Actually, I wanted to ask about this point of the action. So I guess it comes in a good point. I would like to stress out this ambivalence of the concept of action and Anne-Lise you were talking about. And I think there has been said a lot about the physical part of the relation physics, metaphysics, but I would like also to see how it's connected to the metaphysical part if we're looking into this link between physics and metaphysics. And to Anne-Lise, I would like to ask what if you think, or if I understand correctly, the concept of expression would be like the metaphysical way the action is showing within monads. Would it be then the equivalent to the action in the metaphysical realm? And to the other contributors to the panels, I would like to ask, how do you see then, what do you think about expression? Because you didn't say anything about that, but I think expression plays a key role for explaining how the physical or the phenomena has an equivalent within the whatever is happening between the monads. And I'm thinking here about the correspondence of Arnaud, but also about this idea of the law of the series, and there has to be an equivalent or a correspondence between every aspect that happens within the monad and everything that happens within the phenomena. And yeah, that's why, yeah, I think that, yeah, Vincenzo has also written a lot about that. But well, that would be my question.
Anyone want to answer that?
I can answer briefly if you want, but someone else could be fine too.
I would say that as you suggested in your written up part of that comment, that Vincenzo Derisi has done more than anyone else to clarify, or at least as much as most people, to clarify how Leibniz's notion of expression is absolutely central to the metaphysics and the link between metaphysics and physics. But I don't really think it's a controversial point. I think everybody accepts that expression is that's perception is a species of expression, and every single substance has to express the whole of the rest of the universe. And in this, Leibniz sees a foundation for relations of connection that will properly found what we see as causal relations and various other kinds of and spatial relations and so on. So that's all I would say on it. But Anne-Lise, you should say something.
Yes, I just want to say that for me the point was to precise what is new in the definition of substance. Of action as the essence of substance. And my point was to precisely circumscribe what does it mean actio in se ipsum. That is, what does it mean if we use the dynamical, the last dynamical conceptualization after force, the conceptualization of action, the definition of this action in the Dynamica de Potentia, that is this actio in se ipsum, and how it changes the definition of substance. And surely you are right, Laura. There is this, of course, this conception of substance as expressive, but it was not my point. Just so it is my answer.
Okay, thank you. And now,
if I may say something.
Yes, jump in.
Thank you, Lara. I guess that more or less, as they said, everyone agrees that there is a relation of expression between something that happens at the physical and the metaphysical level in Leibniz philosophy. I think that one point of divergence may be whether this expression happens in perception. That is, we know that perception is a kind of expression, but the fact that there is some correspondence between physics and metaphysics that can be called expression doesn't imply necessarily that what I claimed in my book, that is that the metaphysical realm is perceived as physical because of this relation of expression. It may be that there is some kind of isomorphism between physics and metaphysics that has nothing to do with the act of perceiving, and therefore that phenomena are not necessarily involved with perception, but with I guess this might be an answer to your question. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you, Vincenzo. So now Tinka had a question for Christian, and then Christian had some comments that he wanted to make. So Tinka, first your question.
Thank you all for this wonderful panel. Christian, you mentioned Billfinger, and I was wondering if you are reading Billfinger as continuing the Leibnizian project, so as trying to reconcile physics and metaphysics in a way, or do you read him rather working with Wolff's notion of a monad, yes, of a, let's say a monad that lacks actually representative force, yes? How do you situate, how do you place Billfinger in this limit? So
okay.
If you could elaborate.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I don't have an ultimately conclusive answer to this. I think, given what Billfinger says, he oftentimes he refers more Leibniz than to Wolff, which sometimes comes across as surprising if you read his Delucidations, for instance, which is his main work from 1725. I do think he follows. I mean, I would say he follows more Wolff, to be honest, although he mentions Leibniz a bit more often, in that he does seem to think that the pre-established harmony really leaves no doubt that there's a substantial dualism at stake here, and that there's something like mental monads and physical monads which are actually parallel. So I think he has a stronger notion of what like how substantial the physical realm is, which I find like more in Wolff's works than in Leibniz in this effect. So so I think he probably takes more, like if you take Leibniz, he probably takes more of Leibniz's new system in a way, where Leibniz seems to invoke this language of there being two substances, also in the letters that he wrote to people asking questions, and stuff, then to Leibniz language about bodies being phenomena and aggregates. I think in this regard he's more Wolffian, although he oftentimes claims to be going back to Leibniz himself, also in a work where he elaborates pre-established harmony apparently from the mind, like ex mente of Leibniz, so to speak. So I think it's hard to give an ultimate answer, but I think he's probably more Wolffian than he admits in his own writing, so to speak. So I think, yeah, I would go for the Wolffian line, to be honest.
Thank you.
And also I had a comment to one of the things that Rick said, and a super tiny question, curiosity, mainly to about something that Dan mentioned. So the thing about what Rick said is where you mentioned that monads are embodied, and then I was thinking, in a way, this is a bit strange, because if they ground bodies, then how can they be embodied in what they are supposed to ground? So if you take Leibniz saying bodies result from monads, so how can they be embodied in something that they are supposed to form first and foremost? So in this regard, I think I agree more with Dan's feeling that there's more of this disparity between the two realms, so to speak.
Well, I try to answer that in my book of 2018, and I see it as a recursive thing that both of those things are true, that the bodies are aggregates of monads in the sense that they presuppose the monads for their existence, and also that the monads are embodied, because his idea of reducing bodies is not to get rid of them, right? I don't see this as I don't see it as an eliminative reduction. It's what bodies actually are that he's trying to get at, rather than to dispose of them. So when de Volder suggests that he was trying to get rid of them, or when he reads Berkeley, Leibniz responds quite spiritedly, that's not what he's trying to do, right? And so, yeah, I think that there's a very bizarre position, right? It's not materialist, it's not idealist, it's not dualist. On my reading, it's this weird kind of recursive picture.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I can see why here. Yeah. I mean, I think when he talks to Berkeley, he seems to be saying something like they do have some kind of status, but then just as a phenomenon that's not on the same ontological level as a monad, but maybe that's just like my bringing back this more idealist threat. I don't.
Yeah, my reading, the way that a body is a phenomenon. Well, there are a couple of ways. One is that it doesn't have a unity except as far as that's supplied by a perceiver. But the perceiver is still seeing all the constituents, but putting them together in perception, right? So that's one way. Another way is that, and this relates to the question that Bill asked earlier, is that they don't remain the same over time. A body without any form in it does not remain the same thing over time. So what remains the same is the form, not the body. And so bodies are also phenomenal in that sense. That's kind of a more Platonic sense in my reading. So, but I don't think that they are phenomena in the sense of only being internal appearances to a perceiver, even though Leibniz does say that on 1 or 2 occasions. Mostly he talks about them being internal perceptions of what's outside.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right.
Okay, and sorry, I super quickly had one remark. So I taking up what Dan said about Leibniz in the 1670s is interesting that in the 1670s, as you said, Dan, he treats corporeal substances in this scholastic way of being composed of matter and form. And then I found him saying in a 1703 letter to the folder, I distinguish the primitive intelligence or soul, the matter, namely the primary matter or primitive passive power, and the monad made up of these 2 things. So this is a curious passage, but I found him only saying once, which I couldn't really make sense of, because I mean a monad shouldn't be composed of any 2 things since it's indivisible, and even if matter form would be a different kind of divisibility than the one holding in the material realm, I'm not sure Leibniz would be happy with like understanding, for instance, like substance in the same way as the scholastic saying there's some such a thing as incomplete substances. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts about this recurrence of this theme of matter and form coming together, both in corporeal substances in the 1670s and then later even in 1703 to the folder.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think you know what I think happens after the late 1690s when monads are introduced. Leibniz, I think Rick is absolutely right that he doesn't really want to give up bodies, although there are moments when it looks as if he's doing exactly that. Mm-hmm. You know, there is nothing in the world, this is what he writes to de Volder, except, you know, simple substances. Although he doesn't always say that. I think he's struggling with how it is, well, here's an analogy that I like to use. In just the same way as, you know, in contemporary particle physics, physicists, for various reasons, some of them empirical, some of them mathematical, and you know, having to do with symmetry principles and so on, have come to the view that there is an underlying reality, which is very different from the reality that we experience around us. And it is, though, still a question for research, how it is that the properties that we observe in the bodies around us are grounded in these entities and laws that are very, very different from the world as we experience it. Leibniz, for metaphysical reasons, came to the view that the ultimate reality is constituted by monads, which are very different from the things around us. In one way or another, he wants to figure out, well, what is the relationship between the world of monads and the world of bodies as we experience them? And there are a number of different accounts that one can find in the later writings. And I don't think he ever actually arrived at a final answer.
Yeah, I agree with that.
To that. But you can see, I mean, for example, when he's talking about matter and form and active force and passive force in connection with the monads, he still has the picture from the specimen dynamicum in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And is trying to figure out, he doesn't want to give up the dynamics either. And is trying to figure out what to make of the ontology of active and passive, primitive and derivative forces in the context of a world in which the ultimate realities are going to be these monads. So you find these terms being used in various ways, for example, in the de Volder correspondence. Though not, I think, in a stable way. I think he is looking for where to put the forces from the specimen dynamicum into the world of monads.
Yeah, I mean, the de Volder, this passage in the Fuller correspondence is also the only one where I found Leibniz saying that monads are made up of or composed of, like, because that would seem strange.
He says this. He says similar things in the Dubose correspondence as well.
Okay. Okay.
And he's looking for a place to put, and he doesn't want to give up the metaphysics of force. Looking for a place to put it in the monads. And I think it's going to be I think that that's the incompatibility that I see between the dynamics and the monadology. Is it's really hard to find a plausible way of interpreting the dynamical metaphysics within the context of the monadology.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. On that note, I think we should end. So maybe unmute yourselves and thank our speakers by clapping. And next week, I'm doing that. Okay, and next week we will have Christophe Lutti. Oh, what?
You said we're dying can't go to sleep without seeing the image of monad that Pauline has.
Oh, yes, of course. I'm sorry. Let's see it.
Hi, Pauline.
Oh.
And it's perfect because it's got a size, but you don't see the monad. You just see the reflections. You never see the
That's genius.
But it's not living. It's supposed to be a living mirror.
Could be.
It reflects lots of living things.
Well done, Pauline.
That is perfect. Okay, well, see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.